Hello everyone, this is Saidul Abrar and this is Group 1 from International Business Section 1 Winter 2022 from Thomson Rivers University. With me, I have today my group mates Benedicta Ado and Elijah Ajayi, and today we will be talking about the liability of origin, which is a very popular phenomenon in the international business, and the lessons from Smithfield meat and processing in the US during COVID-19. So to begin with, we will first talk about the liability of origin and COVID-19, the meat processing industry, and diplomatic tensions between US and China. Then my fellow group member Benedicta will talk about the Chinese ownership, public legitimacy and Twitter analysis, then health and safety standard and political legitimacy. Lastly, my group member Elijah Ajayi will talk about the application of the research, and he will mainly conclude the presentation. So as you can already tell by now that the main topic of our presentation is liability of origin. I do not know how many of you have heard about it, but I will first explain what the liability of origin is. So in international business field, liabilities of origin is a term used to describe disadvantages of emerging economy multinational enterprises associated with their national origins. Common sources of LOR include incapability of these multinational enterprises due to less developed institutional and technological infrastructures in their home countries, and negative stereotypes about these enterprises in their countries of origin. A new LOR resulting from geopolitical conflict between China and West poses a significant challenge to Chinese firms conducting business in Western countries. Geopolitical and ideological rivalries are not new, nor are the impacts of geopolitical environments on international business. However, this new LOR among Chinese firms is unprecedented in scale and complexity due to the extensive nature of Chinese investments and the heterogeneity of Chinese businesses in their sensitivity to national security in Western countries. There is one more concept that's very similar to LOR, which is named liabilities of foreignness, or LOF, but this one is different. The concepts of LOR and LOF are distinct. First, LOR pertains to disadvantages borne by MNEs in host countries because of where they are from, that is, their specific nationality, while LOF relates to the disadvantages borne by multinational enterprises in host countries as a result of where they are not from. The liability of foreignness, or LOF, is a relative term pertaining to the additional cost incurred by a foreign firm compared to local firm. Second, home country influence is explicitly excluded in the measurement of LOF. While it is a very influence that gives rise to LOR, which is linked to the country of origin, in the marketing field, one of the most widely researched concepts in the country of origin effect, or the influence of the national origin of a product or service on the purchase decision. With developing countries often found to suffer from a negative country image, the focus of the country of origin literature has traditionally been on consumer products and services, rather than the origin-linked disadvantages faced by firms from emerging economies. The concept of liability of origin is thus distinct from both the liability of foreignness and the country of origin. In this presentation, we will examine the country of origin effect on Smithfield Foods, which is owned by Chinese parents, one of the most largest meat companies in US before and during the COVID-19 outbreak. We find evidence that Smithfield experienced legitimacy challenges associated with its Chinese ownership. We conclude that the animosity between a multinational enterprise's home and host countries is an important source of allure, and discuss three strategies that might help companies overcome these challenges. So we begin by examining public sentiment towards Smithfield, a Chinese-owned meat processing company, in April 2020 at the time of COVID-19 outbreak in the US, and a time when US-Chinese tensions were increasing. The study uses tweets to capture public sentiment toward companies of different country of origin in the meat processing industry, an indication of a company's legitimacy in the eyes of public. We compare Smithfield Foods, a wholly owned subsidiary of WH Group of China, with two other meat processing firms, which is Tyson Foods, a family-owned US firms, and JBS USA, which is owned by a Brazilian parent. We find that although there is no difference among the companies in terms of number of negative tweets, Smithfield is more frequently associated with its uh, country of origin than JBS USA. So now I will be talking about the COVID-19, the meat processing industry, and the diplomatic tensions between the US and China. So the world took a big hit by COVID-19 in 2022. The meat processing industry is no different from that hit. The outbreak of COVID-19 in the US in February-March 2020 was an exogenous shock that challenged all the meat processing companies. And as of May 15, 2020, COVID-19 had been detected in 115 meat plants across 19 US states, and 44 plants had been closed, leading to concerns over meat shortages. And Smithfield was wholly accounted for the rise of COVID-19 in two states, which is Iowa and South Dakota. Although the meat processing industry was facing a big challenge because of the safety and hygiene issues, but Smithfield took the biggest hit because of the US and Chinese tensions. The US and Chinese tension is nothing new. It was rising from 2012, but COVID-19 changed everything. After the Twitter analysis, it can be found that 73% of US adults hold negative thoughts about China after COVID-19 outbreak worldwide, because they believe that China is solely responsible for the outbreak, and because of having a Chinese parent. As you can already tell by now that Smithfield is owned by a Chinese parent, it took the big hit. Although it is not part of any political campaign or anything, but people was ignoring or kind of boycotting the Smithfield's product. So this is how the country of origin affects a business negatively. Now the presentation will be continued by my fellow groupmate Benedicta Addo. Thank you.
Now to Chinese ownership and public legitimacy using tweet analysis. There were tweets for Smithfield, Tyson, and JBS using the hashtag that featured the company's name. And then these tweets were posted between April 1st and 28th, 2020. That is the period when many plants were shuttered. Smithfield had a total tweet of 1,609, Tyson had 1,005, and then JBS had 591. Out of the total tweets for Smithfield, 692 of the tweets were with negative polarity, which represents 43%. Tyson had 416, representing 41%. Lastly, JBS had 218, indicating 37% of its total tweets. Looking at the total tweets in relation to negative polarity, there was no statistically significant difference between the three companies in terms of the percentages relative to total tweets. This suggests that Smithfield's overall credibility issue is equivalent to that of the other companies. However, among the 692 negative tweets for Smithfield, 18% had phrases relating to China, whereas only 7.8% of JBS negative tweets reference the keywords Brazil or Brazilian, which shows significant difference statistically. This clearly indicates that Chinese ownership has a greater impact on public sentiment other than other foreign ownership. Similar analysis was done using word cloud for the negative tweets for all three companies within the same period of April 1st to 28th, 2020. While each contained a reference to the company, COVID-19 and coronavirus, workers and employees, plants, among others, only the cloud for Smithfield included the country of origin. In addition, this indicates that Smithfield is subject to a liability of origin that negatively affects its public legitimacy. Chinese ownership and health and safety standards. Working conditions in the meat processing factories are commonly known to be challenging. According to Smith in 2017, non-fatal occupational hazards and illness continue to be 1.5 times higher in meat processing companies than it is in the manufacturing sector. As a result, Human Rights Watch have targeted the meat processing company as a whole. Stafford 2019. Human Rights Watch further points out that the sector advocated for less regulation and that regulatory oversight was limited. Despite the fact that the meat processing sector as a whole has been heavily criticized, there is no indication that Smithfield has stood out since it is Chinese owned. While critics such as Human Rights Watch have condemned the industry's norms, they have not singled out Smithfield for worse infractions. According to Kindi in 2019, complaints filed against each company through the Occupational Safety and Health Administration shows that Smithfield had fewer violations, that's 64 cases, than Tyson, which had 113 cases from May 2015 to May 2020. Also, evidence suggests that JBS had the highest rate of serious worker injuries among the three meat companies. per the results, no evidence specifies that Smithfield failed to meet the industry's health and safety standards. Chinese ownership and political legitimacy. Smithfield Foods, the largest hog raiser and pork producer in the United States, was purchased by WH Group in September 2013. They paid $4.7 billion US, making it the largest acquisition in the United States by a Chinese company to that point, as well as the world's largest pork producer. There has been approval by the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which was based in part on the case that significant economic benefits to the US were involved in the form of increased US-Chinese exports. In contrast to the high-tech sector at the heart of the US-Chinese strategic struggle, Smithfield's business looks to be harmonious with the US government's strategic interests. Smithfield in particular plays a crucial role in the US-China Phase 1 trade agreement, as China pledged to acquire more beef from the US. Indeed, US pork shipments to China established a new high in the first quarter of 2020. Evidence reveals that, prior to COVID-19, Smithfield had a legitimacy issue with the US government. For instance, in 2018, the US Department of Agriculture terminated a $240,000 contract with Smithfield as the US government rolled out an aid package worth $558 million in response to many concerns from politicians that a Chinese corporation was receiving support. Meanwhile, Smithfield had no comparable record of breaking US antitrust rules. There is no proof that Smithfield violated any regulatory norms in the United States, which might lead to political legitimacy issues.
So, to conclude, I'll be talking about the four strategic options that WH Group implemented just to make their company better. Yeah, so the Smithfield case, it suggests that although if a company maintains its American identity, which WH Group tried to do, and is managed in a way that is conform to the industry's norms and the US government priority, there's still a clear evidence that the company is still going to be identified in its negative context as Chinese, because the US citizens, people, they believed the coronavirus, originated from China. So with this case, it's caused the group to implement strategic options, which are the four that are listed: distancing strategy, localization strategy, stakeholder strategy, marketing, and social media strategy. So to start with, the WH Group, they adopted the distancing, which was from home, and localization in the host country, the United States. They tried to distance themselves from mainland China to Hong Kong. At least they did this to try and overcome the liability of origin issue that was related to China, and also they try to localize in the sense that if anyone goes to Smithfield's website, the first thing anyone will notice is like the title on the heading of the website is headquartered in Smithfield, Virginia, Smithfield Food, which is an American food company. So that was how they tried to tackle localization as much as possible. They wanted people to see Smithfield as a an American organization. So secondly, WH Group, they used an hands-off approach. They maintained the American management team, while the group itself, they didn't take an active management role, and they perceived that this will help minimize any deficits relating to the country of origin. They also considered spinning off Smithfield into an independent US listed company, taking on a US partner or even completely divesting. So the degree to which these more radical options are necessary depends on the threat posed by the lack of political or public legitimacy. So the case of WH Group and Smithfield illustrates the importance of a stakeholder strategy that considers the interest of both the government and the public. The group, they shielded themselves from political risk by aligning themselves with the activities of trade goals of both China and the US. They did this trying to achieve a degree of political legitimacy, even though it lasted for just a moment. But WH Group, they they perceive that if the tension between China and the US persists, especially in the area of trade, that they might have to anticipate future restrictions on their actions, which will be imposed by the US government, including the export restrictions and limit on acquisitions. And this outcome is more likely if the security food becomes a national security problem in the US. So Smithfield, they carefully considered whether their current stakeholder strategy, which is another strategy, is robust enough to withstand a future problem or escalation of the US-China tensions. The company approach did not protect Smithfield anyway from the negative public perceptions related to the country of origin, which is China. And this also generally raised a question of how much weight should be placed on evidence of negative public sentiment, and what firms that face this kind of problem can do to improve their public legitimacy. The final strategy, which is the marketing and social media strategy, is related to just trying to increase their reputation and public acceptance. And this simply suggests that the affected company, which is Smithfield, should try to de-emphasize the country of origin, which they've tried doing earlier, or they should directly address the relevant issue in public communications. And this would suggest that they should have an increased emphasis on the public communications delivered via social media, which could be Twitter, Instagram, whichever social media outlet, and they should try as much as possible to be open with this strategy, accommodating the authentic communication with online users, sending positive messages by senior managers, and also trying to improve their image by focusing more on their food quality and the safety and health worker safety as well, and the company ethics. So basically, these are the 4 strategic options that were utilized by WH Group in order to reduce the perception of the people of the United States concerning the company Smithfield, which was bought by WH Group from China. So yeah. So I'll be talking about the application of COVID-19 to the Canadian economy, how it affected the beef supply chain. COVID-19 rattled the Canadian beef supply chain by forcing a shutdown in many slaughterhouses and meat processing plants, and this pushed consumers and customers to panic by buying beef out of a fear of shortage, and basically this caused an increase in the price of beef, while ranchers they received lower prices for cattle being sold. Generally, we Canadians, we beef is a very important grocery item, and yeah, so this really had a great impact in beef consumption. So Canada's slaughterhouses and meat processing plants, they are concentrated among a few large facilities, three of which account for over 4/5, which is 85% of Canada's processing capacity. Facilities in Canada and the United States, which is the main beef trading partner of Canada, were all pandemic hotspots during the first partial lockdown this spring, that's April, reducing the capacity of the slaughterhouses. When 1/4 of Alberta's coronavirus case was traced back to a single meat packing plant. Beef exports to the United States collapsed in April, reducing the net beef trade balance between the value of export and import. In just under 1/4, all this happened. The beef supply chain strength was tested in March when COVID-19 outbreak shuttered 2 plants in Alberta, effectively halting over 2/3, that's 70% of Canadian beef processing, and creating a backlog of livestock bond for slaughter. So with nowhere to send their cattle, animals stayed on feedlots for a longer period of time, corresponding to a month-over-month live cattle and calf price reduced by 6.0% in April. So according to the charts that I have here, you can see that the slaughter rates were down sharply in April by -27.5%, and in May by -31.1% year over year, as described in the chart. And this marked a substantial shift in the year-over-year movement for slaughter rates, which have been trending upward since January 2018. The drop in the Canadian dollar at the beginning of 2020 also contributed to higher prices for meat and most other food items imported from the United States. Because taking COVID-19 into account, it suggests that certain cuts of meat normally sold at food service industry were being sold by retailers at a premium price, and the situation explained why meat prices at local level rose from 10% to 15%. So during the lockdown, cattle prices were affected by fewer exports to the United States, which received the largest share of Canadian cattle. And this was due to the increase in the number of facility shutdowns and fetal and non-fetal employee COVID-19 infections in the United States. And generally, this reduced the American demand for Canadian cattle. Fewer Canadian cattle and beef exports, mainly to the United States, also conceptualized the drop in the domestic cattle prices, as both Canada and the United States have a very highly integrated marketplace. So according to the chart, we can see that there was shortage and lower demand because Canada's net trade balance of beef products with the United States fell sharply in April, which is from March at 15.4 million to 5.7 million. That's a very drastic drop in the prices of beef.